Welcome to Sleepless Readings. Tonight we'll be reading a tale called Every Week a Different Person Tries to Kill Me. Monday. Arguably the most hated day of the week. I'm pretty sure most of the population wakes up dreading to see those cursed 3 letters on their alarm clock. Going from solace to suffering in a single day isn't easy, and it's the same for me as well. By Sunday, I usually have my week's case dealt with. Those last few hours of dying light are usually the only moments I can relax, and so I do. At least until the clock strikes 12, signaling the onset of Monday. Another week, another face to worry about. Needless to say, Monday morning blues hit pretty hard for me, and last week was no different. As per my weekly routine, I wake up as soon as the clock strikes 12. I just sit in my bed for a moment, taking in the dead of the night. As I slowly come to the realization that a new week has started, I immediately head downstairs to fetch my Remington 870 from the gun locker. That sweet beauty has saved my ass on countless occasions. I grab the gun and a cup of coffee and head to the living room, or whatever was left of it in this decrepit establishment. I sit myself down on the office chair in the corner and wait. Wait for this week's assassin. Last week's bastard was a tricky one, nonetheless. I plopped down on my seat in anticipation for something to go bump in the night. 7 hours passed by. Nothing happened. Just the sound of the crickets chirping and an occasional hoot of an owl. Soon after, an iridescent shade of yellow pierced through the windows as the sun rose from its 12-hour slumber. Great, I thought. Another straggler. I stayed inside for the day. I was in no shortage of supplies, and going out would probably risk another walk-in with my pursuer. The day goes by with nothing eventful, aside from a cat leaping onto the broken front porch. The shadows started creeping in as night began. Once again, I braced myself for an all-out assault, but nothing happened. No window breaks, no gunshots, not even the rustling of leaves from my backyard. Even the next day I wasn't attacked. The day went by, almost as uneventful as the last. The night went by without a hitch, and Wednesday morning was on me. I decided to head out for once. Grabbing my hoodie and face mask, I made my way to a nearby park. It was around a mile away from my living quarters. As I neared the tree line that led to the park, I felt like I was being watched. The trees around me seemed to resonate hostility. I picked up the pace and entered the premises, eventually finding a good spot to sit down. A chilly breeze blew past me. The sky grew darker as the minutes passed by. By the time I was ready to head back home, there were around 10 people left. I sat there for about 20 minutes, clearing my mind. The place was so quiet and peaceful. If only it lasted, though. I heard footsteps approaching me from the front. I slowly looked up and met my gaze with the man walking towards me. His gait boasted immense confidence, unlike his slouched posture. He stopped 6 feet away from me. I glanced at his eyes, wide open and filled to the brim with insanity. His sclera were filled with intricate webs of red veins, as if he hadn't been sleeping for days. I locked eyes with him. Neither of us uttered a single word. This intense stare-down carried on for no less than 5 minutes. Me not sure of what move to make, and him itching to drive that kitchen knife in his back pocket straight into my chest. Lucky for me, there were still around 10 people in the park. Obviously, this guy was careful about eyewitnesses. I waited some more, fearing a wrong move would seal my fate. The guy in front of me flinched for a second as a soccer ball bumped into his leg. Some kid was running our way, trying to retrieve the ball. This was it. My ticket out of here. I vaulted the bench and started sprinting towards the woods behind the park. The rapid thuds coming from behind me confirmed that my assailant was in hot pursuit. I just had to outrun this guy and get back to that excuse of a house I had. Trees zoomed past me as I seemingly drew closer to my territory. The guy behind me had not let up, though. Silence echoed through the forest. My ears seemed to completely tune out the ambience and divert their focus to the footsteps, who seemed to ever so slightly gain on me. I looked up in desperation. There it was. That old, dusty, abandoned house. I had left the door unlocked, and it played to my advantage. I knew that I might have around 10 seconds to turn around and lock the door. Everything seemed to slow down around me as I grabbed the doorknob and burst open the door. Turning around as fast as I could, I slammed it shut and deadbolted it. Took me a moment to take in everything that happened. The guy's face was inches away from the frame. He probably took a hit when I slammed it shut. I had no time to spare. I grabbed my trusty firearm and headed for the attic. I pulled the ladder down and climbed up as fast as I could. After sealing the entry hatch shut, I sat down to catch my breath. The attic was dark and cold. It seemed as if nobody had been here for a decade or so. You could probably run into a cobweb every 5 feet or so. I got down on my knees and crawled around, trying to locate the 3 loose floorboards that caved in if anyone stepped on them. Those 3 floorboards were the last of my rapidly dwindling escape plans. I heard a crash downstairs. Of course he'd break the glass, I thought to myself. I grabbed my gun as I heard footsteps shuffling around the living room. They went from room to room, getting closer towards the attic. My attacker ascended the staircase and continued his search for me. It was only a matter of time till he got to the room furthest from the stairs, which was connected to the attic. I grabbed a bunch of rope and positioned myself near the flimsy floorboards, waiting for him to enter the room. The hatch of the attic was near the corner furthest from the door, and the floorboards were near the door of the room. The positioning couldn't have been better. All I had to do was wait. I heard the sound of footsteps nearing the door. My heart started pounding as adrenaline coursed through my veins. The door creaked open. The floorboards creaked as the person proceeded to probe deeper into the room. Judging from the sounds, he walked about 7 feet in and stood near the broken bed frame in the middle of the room. Without a moment's hesitation, I broke through the floorboards and landed hard on my feet. My attacker spun around to face me. His face twisted into an expression of shock. Grabbing the stock of my gun, I charged at him and started bludgeoning him to death. The first strike landed on his head. The second hard on the nape of his neck. I completely lost all sense of reason as I wildly swung my firearm at him. The intruder screamed in pain as I proceeded to beat the shit out of him for another 15 seconds. I stopped to catch my breath. Looking down at all the bloody mess I made, I noticed the guy was hardly moving at all. Seizing the opportunity, I tied him to a bedpost. As I was finishing the last knot, however, I felt resistance in the rope. Glancing at my attacker's face, I noticed that he was staring right at me. His face mere inches away from mine. He began squirming vigorously, trying to break free of his restraints. He began growling like a rabid dog as he tried to bite the rope. I took a few steps back and kept a close eye on him. His body spasmed violently. His maniacal growl was intensified as well. I heard a loud snap as the guy's right arm flailed loosely to his side. He broke his arm to free himself. When he realized it wasn't enough to break free, he twisted his torso and began biting at his broken arm. Judging by just how much he twisted himself, I'm pretty sure he broke a few ribs as well. The broken bones of his right arm began jutting out in a gory display of red. I took a closer look at this guy's face. Tears were rolling down his cheeks as he continued to mindlessly bite his arm off. Another snap of a bone broke me out of my trance. I took a step closer and pointed my gun at him. An unfortunate soul who was a passenger in his own body. One who had no jurisdiction over the reins, yet had complete authority over the pain. I rested the gun on his head. His stare screamed hatred all over. But there's this pain lurking deep within its chasms. I pulled the trigger and put him out of his misery. Trampling over his lifeless remains, I headed downstairs towards the living room, where I kept a calendar I stole earlier this year. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I had 4 days of complete peace. Letting out a sigh of relief, I decided to head down to the river to take a nice, long, refreshing bath. Life's pretty tough around the parts, especially if you're me. Most people drag themselves out of bed just to grind hours at their jobs. For me, it's a game of hide and seek with a being whose identity I have no knowledge of. My house, if you can call it one, resides in the middle of the woods near a small town. Of course, for my own safety, I won't be mentioning the details of my haunts. From what I could deduce, this giant wooden shack belonged to some guy named Robert Speedwagon. Based on the locals' information, he was a lifelong bachelor who died of a heart attack at the age of 89. For reasons unknown to me, this house of his was forgotten and left to rot out in the elements. It ain't much, but you really don't have a choice when you're on the run from both the cops and a randomly chosen assassin every week. To be fairly honest, though, it isn't that bad. I got my basic needs accounted for. The river 300 yards away from my house provides me with all the water I could get. I'm not sure if it's completely safe to drink, but I make sure to filter and boil it before consumption. I haven't got sick yet, so I'm assuming it's not a problem. As for food, there's fish in the river, an apple tree in my backyard, feral hogs in the woods. Those are more of a last resort, though, since I usually get by with the supplies I steal on a weekly basis, even enough to satisfy my coffee addiction. I even managed to get some electricity and use a smartphone with a few solar power banks I stole 3 months back. If you're good at looting and resourceful enough, chances are these conditions wouldn't even faze you. I've gotten used to it by now. And with the predicament I'm in, this is the best I could ask for. But it wasn't always this easy. I almost got stabbed to death on a water refill run by the local baker when it was his turn to kill me. Some kid strangled me in my sleep because I was too careless to lock the windows. I wouldn't be alive if it was a grown man or somebody I couldn't overpower. And don't even get me started with my gunfight with a seasoned Marine. That one took quite a big chunk out of the east wall of my base. It took me quite a while to balance my on-the-run survival and the monster of the week nonsense I'm dealing with here. Even now, I'm still not sure if I have my situation completely figured out. How well my week goes depends on who my killer is. On the rare chance my killer is either very young or very old, they don't even make it to my location in 7 days, much less attempt to kill me. I had a case like that 4 months ago, where some family's toddler living in the town nearby was my killer. The pipsqueak tried to make it out of his front porch for 7 days, only to get dragged back in by his mother. They eventually took him to a psychiatrist on Thursday, and I didn't even have to lift a finger. Usually my killer of the week is someone within 150 miles of my location on the Monday of that week. Sometimes they don't even make it to me by Sunday. After the clock strikes 12 on Sunday, another person becomes my killer. Okay, this is getting pretty confusing, so allow me to explain how all of this started, and how my life spiraled into hell leading me to my current state. Let's wind the clocks back about a year, maybe add a few months, when I was in my senior year of high school. I used to be part of a normal family, my parents and a younger brother. I had a few friends and used to attend school like any kid would. And just like any kid would, I also got kidnapped as well. February. As per my daily routine, I was walking back home from school. It took me about 25 minutes to get back home, 15 if I rushed it. This day, though, I was taking it pretty slow. I remember blacking out somewhere near the desolate side of the neighborhood. As for where I was taken, I still don't have a clue. I woke up in complete darkness. Still dazed, I tried moving my hands around. They didn't budge, though. My wrists were tied down by what seemed like leather restraints. I tried to move my legs to no avail as well. Panic started to cloud my mind as I realized I was tied down to some inclined bed. The darkness provided no information regarding my surroundings. I waited for my eyes to readjust. Suddenly I heard sobbing from my right. I turned my head to see what was going on. Through the darkness, I could make out the outline of another inclined bed with someone strapped to it, although I couldn't make out any features with the lighting conditions. Without even thinking it through, I whispered to the person, "Hey, you there?" The sobbing immediately stopped.
"Who's there?"
A panicked but soft voice responded. "Where the heck are we?" I asked. "What is this place?" The voice choked up for a moment before continuing to sob while answering my questions.
"I don't know,"
he cried.
"She comes in here and takes one of us. She does awful things with us. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want to get hurt."
The voice continued to break down into utter sorrow and hopelessness. He stopped for a moment to weep some more. I was speechless. What was this place? What happened to this guy? What's going to happen with me? A million thoughts flooded my mind, sending a chill down my spine. Just then, the voice resumed talking.
"I don't want to end up like them,"
he said in the most dreadful tone possible. I didn't know what to think of it. I snapped out of my thoughts, realizing that my eyes had adjusted to the darkness a bit. I immediately scanned my surroundings. I could make out the 3 walls to my front and either sides. I didn't have the mobility to look behind me yet. My eyes ran along the wall in front of me. There seemed to be a few cages leaning against the walls. I carefully examined the cages. There appeared to be humans in them. They showed no signs of movement. They simply sat against the cell walls, completely motionless. I glanced towards the cage close to me, and that's when I realized this person was staring right at me. I'd be hard-pressed to call this thing a human. It was humanoid, but barely. This thing had sunken black eyes that seemed to stare right past me. It had no lower jaw, or rather, had it completely ripped off. The lower part of its face and neck seemed to be covered with scar tissue. Instead of a nose, there was a single giant slit. The torso was filled with even more horrors. Imagine an open cavity with all the organs intact and working. You could see the entrails twitch ever so slightly. And the worst part, there was movement near its thorax. This thing was still breathing. It was alive. Or functional, at least. This was just the start, though. As I glanced around the different cages, I noticed a variety of abominations contained behind those rusty bars. There was a giant, bulky humanoid whose face stuck out of its massive stomach. Another had arms jutting out all over its body. Its entire torso was covered disproportionately with appendages that contract every 5 seconds. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. Fear clouded my mind as I stared at another cage, which held a giant blob of organs and blood, which seemed to throb at the same frequency as my adrenaline-fueled heart. Something surfaced from the half-clotted blood plasma which formed this thing's body. A liver, or at least I thought it was. The massive chunk of cells fell down to the ground, making a gut-wrenching sound. It took me everything I had not to puke.
I don't want to be like them,
came the guy's voice.
She's gonna turn us into them.
I had no idea of what was going on, but I was trying not to panic. I tried tugging on my restraints, but it was futile. The one around my left wrist seemed a bit loose, but I didn't have the mobility to pull it out, since my torso was strapped down too. It seemed like there was no way I could escape. A loud crash came from behind. I tried to turn my head around, but I couldn't move. I heard footsteps, followed by a scraping sound, as if a heavy broken door was being pushed out of the way. A cold, malicious aura spread throughout the room. The guy beside me had completely stopped whining, and the deformed humanoids in front of me had gone silent. I froze up. Oblivious to what was coming for me, I stayed in place and closed my eyes. The footsteps came closer to my bed and stopped. I felt a cold breath on my face. It was putrid beyond anything I could ever imagine. Even holding my breath had no effect on the disgusting stench inches away from my face. I didn't want to open my eyes. I didn't want to witness whatever demonic entity lurked just beyond the confines of my eyelids. Unfortunately, I had to let up. It felt as if I had no authority over my senses. I was forced to embrace the sight before me, and nothing could have prepared me for it. 2 bright green eyes, completely open, as if there were no eyelids to bound the vast malevolence they contained. A crooked smile filled with yellow teeth, some chipped away in irregular ways, making them look like serrated knives, waiting to dig into my flesh. Her cheeks cut open from the lips to amplify the magnitude of her vicious smile. She was bent over me, with her hair dangling all around my face. They felt rough and scaly, almost resembling snakes. She continued to stare at me for a solid minute before lifting her head back up. She wore a dirty white gown, kind of like those cliché ghost girls in movies. Her nails were sharp and pointy, and her skin was dry and pale. She looked too dead to be moving around. I blinked my eyes once and she disappeared. It took me a second to realize she was gone. I panicked and jolted my head around, trying to make sense of the situation. I turned my head to the left and froze. There she was, an inch away from my face, staring intently at me. I screamed and started thrashing around violently, trying to break free from the chains that bound me. She walked around to my right side. I stopped squirming and paid attention to her whereabouts. As she made her way to the other side, she drew out a big cutter blade, all while giggling like a psychotic grandma.
We have a new playmate,
she muttered under her rancid breath. She rested her cold, clammy arm on my chest and tore open my shirt.
Let's see,
she said, not averting her gaze for a single moment.
You are number 420.
I couldn't do anything but stare as she slowly started cutting into my flesh while laughing her ass off. Her strokes began growing more frantic and violent, and all I could do was scream and cry. Even with all my screams, her laughter drowned out my voice and echoed around the room. She was carving some weird symbols on my skin. I felt my own blood dripping down from my chest onto the bed. My vision got blurry as tears flooded from my eyes. 40 seconds went by. She stopped, but the pain never did. My wounds felt like they were burning, even to this day. This crazy woman then turned around and made her way to the guy beside me. I managed to get a good look at him. He was probably around 5 years older than me, had a mohawk and a goatee. The most terrifying feature, however, was the bloody scars that covered around 60% of his skin. This woman clearly did a number on him. He didn't dare utter a single word, though. He just lied there on his bed, shaking with fear. His body vibrated so intensely I almost felt it 15 feet away.
Today's your lucky day,
she said with a smile.
No.
The guy pleaded.
No, please.
The woman took off all his restraints, except for his left leg. The guy immediately tried to get up and run, but was unable to break free from that last leather belt on his leg. The woman then pulled out a giant saw and laughed. The guy started crying again. Using both hands, she hacked at the guy's leg, severing it at the knee. The guy screamed in agony, probably even damaged his vocal cords in doing so. The woman then pulled out a big metal stake, which was attached to a chain and rammed into the guy's left thigh. She let it drop to the floor and grabbed the chains. I couldn't look at the guy. He was pleading to me for help. She dragged his ass across the floor and out of sight. It took me quite a while to register everything that went down. From what I saw, it was clear I wasn't staying alive if I stuck around. I had to get out of here. With renewed vigor, I once again began pulling at my restraints, trying to break free. 10 minutes passed, but it didn't budge. The cuff around my left wrist was still fairly loose, but not enough. I couldn't quite move my body enough to pull it out of there. Just then, a crazy thought broke into my mind. What if I broke it? What if I somehow dislocated my wrist to break free? I contemplated the thought for a second, imagining how the scenario would play out. However, immense dread swept over me. I didn't have the guts to break my own wrist, much less bear with the pain that followed. A scream broke through the dead silence of the room. It was from the guy tied behind me. They were coming from somewhere above and behind me. His screams were audible for a few seconds before being completely swallowed by the most demonic bout of laughter I've ever heard. Now my blood was pumping. I looked at the cages in front of me. The malformed creatures had grown a bit more active. I took one last look at the cages and noticed something. 2 of them were completely empty. Within each of their confines lay a giant sign made out of cardboard, upon which a single word was carved. Reserved. That was all it took to sell me on the idea. I looked at my left wrist. It was still firm from the anticipation. For the next 5 minutes, I stared at it hard, building up the courage to set my plan into action. Snap. That was all I heard. Dead silence followed soon after. A few seconds went by with nothing. Then a colossal wave of anguish jolted past my arm and resonated all over my body. It was unbearable. I laid there completely motionless, trying to keep it all in. I couldn't let up now. One scream and she'd come barreling down to get me. Even with the immense pain, I finally found just the right angle to slip my right hand through. My hand ached from being forced through, but it was a walk in the park compared to my left side. With my right hand free, I got to work, taking off each and every one of my restraints. It did take a while, but I was on my feet and ready to scram. Bracing my left hand, which now dangled loosely from my side, I took off. There was a giant door at the back of the room, right behind my bed. This was probably the one she used, because it was wide open. Great. One major obstacle cleared. I quietly ascended the stairs onto the upper level. From the looks of it, I was in the basement of some abandoned psych ward or something. There were offices, operation theaters, and rooms entirely filled with beds. I was somewhere in the middle of this giant complex. The hall to my left led to the front entrance. I could head for that, or find a broken window to jump out of. A high-pitched scream broke the silence. I heard someone thrashing around from the basement I came out of.
Where did you go?
I heard a familiar voice scream. She yelled out a few more times, throwing a tantrum. A chill ran down my spine when I heard rapid footsteps ascending the stairs behind me. Without thinking, I ran up the stairs to the second floor. Her frantic footsteps trailed close behind. As I got onto the next level, I immediately ran down one of the hallways towards the right side of the complex, far away from my destination. I turned into one of the rooms and hid behind a desk. She wasn't far behind. I heard her footsteps 20 seconds after I jumped into the room. I held my breath and waited. My wrist was throbbing like crazy. I felt as if I would die from the pain itself. Her footsteps slowly walked past the door and continued deeper down the hallway. I waited for 2 minutes to play it safe. After I was sure she wasn't around, I carefully made my way back down the ground floor, where the entrance was. I would hide every time I heard something near me and hold my breath. I found a broken plank in one of the rooms and decided to keep it with me. This continued until I reached the bottom of the stairs. I tiptoed past the hall and turned the corner. What I was met with almost made me gasp. It was her. She just stood there in the hallway, her back facing me. I didn't know what to do. My mind went completely blank out of sheer terror. My body had other plans, though. As if on autopilot, I ran towards her and caught her completely off guard. Like a feral beast, I got on top of her and started beating the living crap out of her. I didn't hesitate, even for a moment. Before I even knew it, she was on the ground, completely limp. I didn't bother with her for even a moment. I turned tail and ran for the exit. Before I could make it 5 feet away from her, I felt something pierce through my leg. I fell hard on the ground and, unfortunately, used my left hand to break my fall. I was past my point of tolerance. I began crying. The pain in my leg was just as bad. I felt a tug on my leg which further raised the pain. This woman, she was dragging me towards her. The giant stake was embedded deep in my leg. She dragged on the chains till I felt a cold hand grab my foot. I started panicking. She slowly crawled her way onto me. With one swift pull, she yanked the stake out of my leg. My screams only grew louder, to the point where even my throat was burning. She grabbed the stake and lodged it into my chest. I couldn't react at all. My mind was far too gone at this point.
I won't let you run away!
She screamed.
Wherever you go, I will hunt you down!
She pulled the stake out and blood gushed out of my body. I glanced up at her wretched face. She raised her hand to her face and pulled out one of her eyeballs. She flinched momentarily, then proceeded to shove the organ deep within the hole in my chest. I was close to blacking out now. I felt my sanity completely slipping. Before I passed out, I heard her chant a peculiar phrase in a language completely unknown to me. I don't know where they found me, or even how they found me. Apparently, I'd been missing for 3 days. The doctors patched up my arm and leg, which surprisingly healed within a month. Later on, I got discharged from the hospital and returned home, and lived a happy life with my family. For a month and a half, at least. I was returning from a friend's house one day. It wasn't really dark out, so I wasn't really concerned. About a block away from my house, that's where I met him. A man. He just stood there, staring at me. Of course, my first thought was to scram back to my house and call the cops. But something froze me in place. His eyes. Red veins dominated his sclera, and those green irides glistened under the streetlight. They radiated the same insanity I saw in her. It took me a while to get back to my senses and hightail it out of there. I told my parents and they called the cops. Nothing came out of it, however. The man was never found, at least till Friday. My parents drove off to run a few errands. That's when the bastard chose to strike. If it wasn't for my father's Remington, I'd have been dead. The next week came by. Albeit a bit shaken, I decided to carry on with life. On that week's Tuesday, the nurse tried to stab me on my checkup at the hospital. She was detained by the cops, so the rest of my week was relatively smooth. The third week was some stoner from the town over, who was taken to the station on the Saturday of that week. I honestly could have lived with myself, at least till the fourth week. I was under the sheets on Sunday night when I heard a sound. The clock struck 12. Monday had officially begun. I slowly peeked behind the covers, only to come face to face with a dark figure looming over me. It was my brother, his eyes filled with that same malice. Seeing those eyes is one thing, seeing them on your brother's face was another. That night, something died within me. That week was the only week she managed to destroy who I was. I don't remember what happened next. It was all a blur. What I do remember clearly is sitting in a pool of his blood, his skull almost completely shattered open. My mom and dad rushed into the room, only to witness a mere husk of their son sitting upon his brother's mangled remains. What lies within this empty body is something I can't even fathom. All I know is, that week, the witch had won. Possessed or not, no person can stay sane after busting open their sibling's skull. And I know for sure I died as a person that day. I ran away. I could never see that place with the same eyes again. I scrammed into the woods and skipped town. With each week, she possessed a different body just to witness my death. She's prowled the lands in search of her prey, treading along with a new pair of boots every week. The eye she placed within me is her beacon, which leads her straight to me. I don't know how to stop this, but I wish to finish her off, once and for all. She destroyed the human within me, and I can't rest till I've purged those who I've killed of her demonic clutches. Until I find a way, however, I guess I'll be getting my hands dirty, over and over again. I pray that no one has to witness the death of their own humanity right before their eyes. The clock just struck 12. Ah, damn. Well, guess I'll go retrieve the shotgun. Monday's here. Another week, another kill.
Thank you for listening. That was Every Week a Different Person Tries to Kill Me. If you enjoyed that, please consider subscribing for more. I release a new story every Sunday. And as always,
Stay sleepless.